No, Fordlandia is not the new name of the province of Ontario. Shudder to think. Fordlandia was once a bustling American manufacturing town in the middle of Brazil. It's still there. I'm Larry Fedorik, and this is Later That Same Life. On each episode of my weekly podcast, a different topic, discussion, or story from our lives.
Season 18, Chapter 2.
Fordlandia.
Fordlandia. Been around for almost 100 years, but only recently did I find out about this curious parcel of land in the heart of the Amazon jungle, Henry Ford's Folly. This week, let's look at the strange tale of Fordlandia. To call Fordlandia a town is a bit of a misnomer. Originally, it covered about 2.5 million acres of land in the Brazilian rainforest. That's an area about the size of Jamaica, if that helps. State of Connecticut? No? How about 1.8 million football fields? Well, it's a lot of land. To understand why Henry Ford built Fordlandia, we need a bit of history. I'll try and be brief. Don't want to get too bogged down. In the late 19th century, young Henry Ford worked as an engineer for the Edison Illuminating Company. I love that name, Illuminating Company. Hey son, the future is in illumination. At night, with the help of his illumination, Ford tinkered in his garage with a horseless carriage. He didn't invent it. There were already quite a few of them around. Oldsmobile predates Ford, and in Europe they already had the Benz motor wagon. Before he founded the Ford Motor Company in 1903, Henry Ford had two previous corporate ventures. There was the Detroit Automobile Company and the Henry Ford Company. Side note, he left the Henry Ford Company after a dispute with investors, and it became Cadillac. Half a dozen years later, it would be purchased by a newly formed company known as General Motors. Along the way, Henry Ford had met a fellow engineer, Harold Wills, a.k.a. C. Harold Wills, a.k.a. C.H. Wills. His full name was Child Harold Wills. Yeah, Child, granted with an E. But as an adult, he didn't appreciate being called Child, so he just went with Harold Wills. He was a smart young whippersnapper. At a young age, he was already head of engineering at an adding machine company, but this was Detroit. Like many young men, he had the car bug. Wills is a key not only to the success of the Ford Motor Company, but to the very idea of Fordlandia. Though Wills and Ford were both engineers, Ford was an astute businessman. He knew how to get investors, how to raise the cash. When he brought Wills along for the new Ford Motor Company, Wills had no money. Ford gave him 10% of his stock, so they were actual partners in this new venture. Wills' official title at the Ford Motor Company was Chief Engineer. Wills was also a master mechanic, an artist, and a metallurgist. He designed the silver and blue oval with the unique Ford script that is still used as the Ford logo to this day. That was Wills. Wills also thought that the steel available for Detroit automakers was subpar. It was too heavy, rotted quickly, and yet soft enough that these car chassis could easily bend after bouncing down those old American roads. Potholes. Oh, we hate them. This is part of the genius of Wills as a metallurgist. He knew of this new nickel-chrome vanadium steel that was much lighter and much more durable and wouldn't rust. Problem was, there was no foundry large enough to make the quantity of steel needed to build millions of Ford cars. But Wills discovered this small steel company in Canton, Ohio. He offered to buy them if they used the money to upgrade facilities to produce this new lightweight steel. Done. Within a year or two, it was Ford that had the advantage, this durable, lightweight product rolling off the assembly lines. The idea of owning the steel foundry became a principal business model for Henry Ford. In a few short years, every component that was put into a Ford car came from a Henry Ford-run business, except for one. And that's where Fordlandia comes in. Footnote on Harold Wills. By 1919, he had a falling out with Henry Ford. Engineering differences, business disagreements, misaligned personal values. He quit and or was forced out. It was a bit of both. Wills was now himself a multimillionaire, so he founded his own automotive company. And he made the Wills St. Clair. It was a highly superior car to the Ford, but it was also more expensive. Very complicated and costly to repair. It never really caught on. After about 7 years, the company folded. Only about 12,000 Wills St. Clairs were made. Only 80 are known to have survived. Jay Leno owns one, because, of course he does. He owns one of everything. Harold Wills, not forgotten, but certainly a lesser-known part of American automotive history. There is a Wills St. Clair Museum. It's in Marysville, Michigan. That's where the original plant was. It's upstate Michigan. It's actually a little bit south of Sarnia, Ontario. They helped preserve the Wills legacy. There's one thing that Henry Ford did not like to share, and that was the credit. But without Wills, there may not be a Ford. Henry Ford was many things: a captain of industry, a business baron, automotive tycoon, racist, bigot, anti-Semite. Oh yeah, he was all those things, but he was also an autocrat. An autocrat. And you might say, well, fine, why not? He owns the business. Business is not a democracy. Well, that's true, but Henry Ford took it to a new level. Ford believed strongly in the concept of the company town. And I don't mean just a town where a major industry has sway over the population, but a company town where you shopped at the company store, attended company social events, where the company owned the schools and the churches, the hospitals, the police, etc. Self-sustaining communities with strict rules, not only for on the job, but around the town. Ford felt he could build these orderly, picturesque societies centered around the Ford business, all under his purview. Did you know in the 1920s, Henry Ford invested more money into making and promoting country music than anyone else in America? Why? Well, Ford was both appalled and frightened at the urban decadence of couples jazz dancing. So he promoted good old white American country music. Isn't that amazing? Ironic, too, that during America's Great Migration, circa 1910 to 1940, so many African Americans fled the Jim Crow South for the economic opportunities offered by the Detroit auto industry. With them, they brought their music, jazz, blues, gospel, which eventually began Motown. Detroit eventually known as much for the autos as for the music, the heartbeat of soul music in America. Bet you Henry Ford was turning over in his grave. But yeah, these company towns, Alberta, Pequanning, Big Bay, Michigan, Ford company towns, owned and operated. But none were more ridiculously ambitious than Fordlandia, in the heart of Brazil. Yeah, I did say brief history, right? Well, too late, I guess. Sorry. Again, and especially after World War I, every component of a Ford car came from a Henry Ford-run company, except for rubber. Rubber for tires, the hoses, and the seals. In the day, rubber was largely imported from Asia. It was Great Britain that controlled the global rubber market. Rubber was both expensive and part of an unreliable supply chain. If only the rubber could come from a Ford-run company. Henry Ford knew that the rubber tree was actually native to South America, so he envisioned his own rubber plantation with thousands of workers living in his newly constructed company town, which he would call Fordlandia. He negotiated directly with the Brazilian government for the acquisition of 2.5 million acres of land, promising them the development of the land, local jobs, and eventually a share of plantation profits. In exchange, there would be no political interference, and he would run Fordlandia as his own kingdom, a sovereign state in a foreign land run by an American corporation. that was run by the autocrat, Henry Ford. Agreed. The property is on the banks of one of the largest rivers in the Amazon, Tapajos, which can be accessed from the Atlantic Ocean, meaning that shiploads of supplies began arriving. This is around 1928. In the day, the American press hailed this as a great adventure and visionary progress. Indeed, the old newsreel footage shows that by 1930, on the banks of this river, through a primitive jungle, suddenly you see a slice of Americana, a town that looks like it was plucked from Middle America and set down in Brazil. A town that had a water tower, a town square, sidewalks with white picket fences, a fire hydrant on every corner. There was houses, a school, playground, church, a store, a state-of-the-art hospital, even a swimming pool and a golf course. Alas, also a graveyard. 90 workers perished in that first year of clearing the land, 3 times that by the end of year 2. Thousands of Brazilians, beset by poverty, traversed to that area with families in tow at the promise of Ford's $5 a day wage. Of course, the families would have access to housing and health care and education. Workers would end up dying of heat exhaustion, bites from pit viper snakes and vampire bats, or attacks from jaguars and caimans. Hey, it's a jungle out there. Eventually, the town and the plantation would be built. The town would house about 2,000 people and their families, both on the rubber plantation and in the town's processing plant, sawmill, generating facility, etc. And Ford's draconian idea was to impose the Midwest American lifestyle and values onto the locals. Living and working in this company town, this company state, came with laws, rules. They were required to attend church, square dances, the good old country music. You could only cook and eat certain foods. You had to maintain a yard and a garden. If you didn't, there would be a fine. Eventually, a lot of workers didn't even get a wage. Instead, they got credits for the company store, which was the only place you were allowed to shop. By 1931, the workers revolted. They cut the telegraph wires, and they chased the American Ford employees out into the jungle. The Brazilian military had to be called in to restore order. And if the breakdown of this Ford-imposed society wasn't enough, Ford did not employ any biologists or botanists or rubber tree experts. That's odd. Well, they didn't replant enough rubber trees. And when they did, they planted them all side by side, which you're not supposed to do because rubber trees are very susceptible to disease. And if they're side by side like that, once one of them gets infected, the rest fall like dominoes, which is what happened. Not only that, the outskirts of the town were beset by opportunists who brought booze cans and brothels. Venereal disease was so rampant at one point that the hospital was overwhelmed. You know how it is. Once one hooker gets infected, the rest fall like dominoes. I guess with the failure of the plantation, no one used a rubber. Sorry. And the biggest thing, in a land far, far from Fordlandia, scientists had invented synthetic rubber. They'd been working on it for years, even as Ford was planning Fordlandia. Did Henry Ford think to invest in a synthetic rubber factory? No. He wanted his own rubber plantation and kingdom. Synthetic rubber. This would be a seemingly unlimited supply of rubber for the automotive industry and everything else, suddenly making the Ford plantation virtually worthless. For his investment of well over $20 million, which would be like $400 million today, Fordlandia never produced enough rubber for a set of tires. Fordlandia was largely abandoned by 1934, and years later would be sold back to the Brazilian government for just under $200,000. The visionary project became known as the Lack of Vision Project. Another classic example of, I guess I didn't think this through. And, I don't know this, but I'll bet that because of the type of leader Henry Ford was, there were a lot of Ford executives who, when they heard this, thought the boss had lost it. But they were probably too scared to say anything. Today, Fordlandia still exists on the banks of the Tapajos River. The water tower, the factory, many of the buildings and bungalows still standing, all looking a little worse for wear. And there are still about 2,000 people who live there, mostly farm workers now and migrants. Some are descendants of the people who worked for Henry Ford and I guess attended those square dances. No real roads lead to it. It's mostly accessible by boat. You know, if you thought Edsel was the most famous Ford misstep, you'd be wrong. It's Fordlandia. Hey, which reminds me, Henry Ford's idea was to build these bungalows for all the workers, but he also built these large plantation mansions meant for American Ford executives, including one that was built exclusively for his son, Edsel, should he decide to visit. Apparently he did visit once, never stayed at that house. The mansion's still there. It's maintained by a live-in caretaker. No one is sure who actually owns it.
Now for the moment I'm sure you've all been looking forward to. A look at the newest member of the Ford family of fine cars, the Edsel, the car that is already making automotive history for Ford Motor Company. A new and different car in every respect, yet with a classical element of conservatism in its styling, which will give it maximum appeal. Edsel cars will go on display in advance of public showings in most company locations beginning August 27th.
There are at least a half a dozen YouTube videos out there that'll show you amazing vistas of the current Fordlandia landscape. And you can also find some of those early newsreels showing its development. They are fascinating if you feel like checking them out. There's also a book, Fordlandia, by Greg Grandin, considered the definitive published work on this subject. Beyond Fordlandia is a 2017 documentary. Fordlandia, though not completely abandoned, it's still functioning as a community of sorts, although not for its original intention. But it reminds me a bit of Hashima. Do you know about Hashima? Hashima is an island off the southern coast of Japan, specifically off the port of Nagasaki. Some people call it Hashima Island, but Shima is a Japanese suffix meaning island, so it's simply Hashima. If you can't quite picture it, think of that abandoned apocalyptic-like scene in the 2012 Bond film Skyfall. That's Hashima. They filmed there. Speaking of car companies, Mitsubishi bought the island in the mid-1800s. Why? Well, huge coal supplies were found in the seabed below the island. So Mitsubishi, then basically a steamship company that needed a lot of coal, bought the island and set up a mining facility. Soon they also built some homes and structures for the workers so they wouldn't have to ferry to and fro the island every day. As the mining venture grew, it began to almost outsize the island. So Mitsubishi actually extended the size of the island by using coal slag. And then this flat part of the extended island, they built a big concrete wall around it to protect it from the waves. That's pretty much the look it has today. They added more mining facilities, more apartments, more schools, a hospital, so on and so forth. At the high point, 5,000 people lived and worked on that island. It was the most densely populated area in all of Japan. The coal finally ran out and they closed it in 1974, completely abandoned by law. For years it was forbidden to go there. Today, though, they've opened it up for tourists, and it's actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site. There's something about these abandoned or nearly abandoned cities. Hashima, Pripyat in Ukraine after Chernobyl. Krakow, that famous abandoned hilltop village in southern Italy. There's more of these around the world, these so-called ghost towns. Fordlandia, not so much a ghost town, but the ghosts of ideas still prevalent. Failed ones, of course. They're relics, old but not ancient. They're not ghost towns, but still spooky in their way. I'd like to go to Fordlandia one day. If I do, when I'm there, in Henry Ford's honor, I'm going to do some jazz dancing.
Later That Same Life is written, voiced, and produced by Larry Fedoruk. LarryFedoruk37@gmail.com. Subscribe to Larry's podcast YouTube channel. Get automatic notifications with each new episode.